What's going on, y'all? We are back live and we are going to do something new in the new year. I know we've said it a couple times that we were relaunching the podcast, relaunching our narrative, and we are going to actually do that. So I'm honored to have my good friend, my fellow soldier in the movement, a master storyteller with me here on the podcast. And he needs no introduction, but you guys know him, Dontaye Carter. He owns his own media company, Carter Media. He's also the vice president of the Atlanta chapter of the NAACP, really big in the Democratic Party. So many other things that we could say about Dontaye, but most importantly, he's a family man, he's a father, he's a husband, he is a Georgian. And so without further ado, Dontaye, introduce yourself to the people.
Man, why are you trying to act like these folks don't know who we are?
That's true. That's true.
Man, for those tuning in, I'm sure y'all are very familiar with Attorney Griggs, with me, very familiar with what we stand for, what we're about. And just sitting back, we were talking. I'm in my basement in my new podcast room. Attorney Griggs is in his, and we were talking about the message and the narrative and why it's so important, right? And of course, I deal with these things a lot, but I don't know. I think I'm just going to kick it off. What really got it started for me today was sitting down watching 688 and really seeing that there were people that did not add on to that story that were added into the story. And first
of all, tell people what the movie is, because I think some people know what it is, but then most people don't. So tell people what the movie's about.
It's about an all-black female battalion that was sent overseas during World War II, and their goal, they didn't want them doing any mission type work, but they had them doing mission type work. And so their first big mission was they had 17 million pieces of mail that was backlogged. And it may seem small, but they were the ones who helped bring hope back to America. They helped deliver hope. They were the ones who were in charge of making sure that families knew that their sons, their fathers, their husbands were still alive, that they were doing well. And so they were given 6 months by the American government to do it, and they got it done in 90 days, which is a huge feat in and of itself. They did it in a rat-infested warehouse. And I think that when I think about how pure vibranium the story of black women are, right, and what they do day in and day out, you don't have to inject someone else into that story to make it sell itself, right? That story can sell itself without. And so there was a young man at the beginning of the movie that was driving a sister around town up in Philadelphia. And for those who saw the movie, know exactly which young man I'm talking about. And I just I thought it was ironic that in a time of such extreme segregation, that this relationship would carry on the way it did. And it kind of caught me off guard. And so I was like, let me learn more about this story, right? Like, if this is a true story, let's dive into it. So I started diving into it, and turns out that there was a young man by that name. He was a friend of this sister that was featured in the movie, but it wasn't prominent. But the movie made it prominent, and I started to feel some type of way, because this was a woman who was married to a black man, and in real life, she's married to a black man, was married to a black man during this time, but he was sort of the backdrop there. And I was just like, why can't we just have a movie about black excellence that showcases black love and black excellence without it having to be diminished by something else? And then that's not the only kicker, right? I'm pretty sure they featured this woman in this story because they wanted to be able to tie in the young man that was driving her around town and who she went and worked in his house as the maid. And I mean, it's just all type of crazy. But the movie was good on its own. It didn't need those elements, right? It didn't need any of that. And what was so powerful is I believe her name was Corporal Adams, who the young lady from I'm trying to think of her name. It'll come back to me. Mm-hmm. but she had three different degrees, super intelligent, right? Was the highest ranking black person at the time. And it's like there's no backdrop to her story about how I mean, this is the 1940s. You know, she went through some ish. You know what I'm saying? And we're not
Mm.
talking about it. We're not getting the context. And I think that's why having these podcasts are so important because it allows us to tell these stories in our own voices. You know, and everybody keeps saying, well, many of these women are still alive. Yeah, but I think what so many people forget in mentioning that a lot of these women are still alive is the fact that many of these folks who told their stories weren't in control of how their stories were going to be told on Netflix. And that's what I have the issue with is if we're going to have these stories, right, create the space for these stories to breathe in their totality. Like, yeah, you can show what they're going through, but we can be honest about what happened during this time period without feeling like we need to inject a white savior or a white hero into this story. Like, um, for 500 plus years, black folks, I think, have done pretty well with being able to survive and us being able to see their strength. And I just I'm looking at this thing and I'm like, man, this had the potential, as good as it was, to be even better. Like, let's get out of this having to whitewash our stories and let's tell our stories for what they are and allow our heroes to shine for who they are. And so that was just something that kind of hit me. But I'm sorry, I went on a little tangent there. I'm gonna pass it back over to you.
Yeah, man, you were telling about a story, and unfortunately, I haven't watched the movie yet. So hopefully, for those who haven't watched the movie, they will still watch it. And I mean, I agree with you. In this new era of new media, it's time for us to be, pure and authentic in the telling of our narrative. It's enough of others telling our stories through their lens. Let's tell our stories through our lens, and that's kind of why we want to relaunch these conversations, this podcast, to make sure we are true to our own narrative. That's not to demean anybody else's narrative, but for far too long, African Americans and people of African descent have not had an opportunity to have a full throated platform upon which to be their authentic selves. And I think the ability of these new platforms, our podcast, so many other podcasts that are giving it pure and raw and uncut, pure vibranium. And so I agree with you on that. But I
Can
do
I?
want to take a moment because in Atlanta we lost a legend today, and I just want to take a moment to reflect on the loss of Senator Vincent Fort. He was a good friend of mine, good friend of the movement, good friend of Atlanta, and he succumbed to an illness earlier today, and we are starting to see all over social media people giving him his flowers. Personally, I've known Senator Fort most of my adult life and some of my formative years as a teenager. My mother taught at Peyton Forest Elementary School, many of you know, and Senator Ford's children went there, and so I've known him for a long time. Been honored to have worked with him both in his capacity as a state senator, but more importantly as an activist. He was at some of the biggest marches in Georgia history, Women's March, March for Our Lives, all the Black Lives Matter marches, and so to get that information and that news that he had passed, it touched me because we're continuing to lose many of the soldiers of the old movement, many other soldiers who have helped bridge the gap to this new movement. And so I thought it was important to open some space to acknowledge the great work that he's done for Georgia, both as an elected official, but as an activist and as a voice for progressive politics. So I'm really sad in this moment. I've been getting text messages all evening when the news came out, and I'm hopeful that people told him how they felt about him prior to his passing. Because many times in this movement, we don't tell people how we feel about them until after they're gone. We're telling each other. And so I got a chance to always tell Vincent how I felt about him, how he's a great mentor. But I hope that, of course, he's in a better place, no longer dealing with any of the ailments that he had, and that, people gave him his flowers while he was still here. So I wanted to make some space for that. But Dontaye, I really want to jump into this conversation about why it's important for us to use these platforms to, one, inform people, but two, have open and honest and frank conversations about where we are as a community, both African Americans and all of our allies and supporters, and all of those that are trying to move this country forward, trying to move the state forward, but also trying to raise a next generation. And I think it's important for us to have these platforms. So as we see what's happening, we're not going to pretend like we don't know what's about to happen. Next year there's going to be a new administration. There's going to be a wholesale attack on civil rights and others' rights. But why do you think it's important for us in this space to own our narrative?
And let me I'm gonna jump into that, but let me say this in terms of the point that I was making earlier. I have no issue with that story if it is in fact the true story. But when stories are injected into our narratives and out of place, out of timeline, out of whatever, to portray a different scenario, I have an issue with that. And that's what brings us to this moment that we're in right now, is because we're seeing it with the media right now. Now all of a sudden, Donald Trump's not the bad guy anymore. You know what I'm saying? He's the president. He's the president elect. Everybody's moving as though the last 4 years, the last 8 years did not happen. With without a doubt, right? Everything that happened still happened. But if we don't own our narratives, if we're not providing context, they will erase these things and make it seem as though it was all in our head when we know, as African Americans, through the stories that our ancestors have left behind, that these things have never been in our head. And we have to be careful because they'll change they'll start changing around DEI, that narrative, and how we came into these rooms. And oh man, so and so just wasn't good enough, but the ones that were good enough made it here. And it's like, but who determines who's good enough? Who determines who can sit at these tables? Who determines whose stories are told? Who determines which rappers are going to be the next big thing? Who determines which actors are going to be the next big thing? These are businesses, these are corporations that overwhelmingly we don't own. And so, because we don't own them from the foundation up, that means we're not the ones telling these stories. That means we're not the ones that are crafting these narratives. It's coming from outside of our community. And anytime it comes from outside of our community, it's not going to be a story told in the most effective way. They have that old African proverb that says, until the lion learns to write, the hunter will always, be the hero in the story. And it's like, no, that's we have to understand that our voices in each and every situation matter. Our voices in politics matter, our voices in the classroom matter, and we have to do the work of ensuring that we're educated enough in our own history to make sure that we can tell our stories in the best way. I don't care about how eloquent the stories are. I care about how we put these stories out, how we craft them, and how we ensure that our children, that our grandchildren, that 5 generations from now, they understood what happened right now in each and every one of these moments, how we persevered, how we made an impact, and how we ensured that there was a place for them in this world.
Absolutely. And I think that, we owe it as the professional generation to be honest truth tellers about the moment in history that we're in. And we all lived through it, whether it was the last 8 years, since 2016 to now. We all know what we lived through, and we have to be honest. And I think that's one of the troubling things I'm seeing, especially in national media, is a reshaping of the narrative. Let's be clear. There was an event that happened. January 6th happened. There were cases that happened that now appear as though they're in doubt. Particularly the case in Atlanta has now been thrown into doubt by the decision of the Court of Appeals. And I know there's been plenty of people in my comments and in my inbox trying to get a full grasp of what happened there. But we have to be complete truth tellers so that the next generation, or as you said, 5 generations from now, understands this moment in history, understands that there were people of good conscience who have, will, and shall continue to stand up for what's right, what's the truth, what's the law. And so I think that's why it's important for us to continue to have these conversations. I can remember, after the first administration, a group of people coming together, known as the resistance, to push back. I think that's probably going to happen again. Um, you know, and I think that we have to be conscientious in the information that we're taking in and who are the gatekeepers of that information. I know, right now we're streaming on a platform, that would be X, that seems to traffic in disinformation and, mistruths, but we also are cognizant that we as consumers of the information have supercomputers in our hand. So it's really on us to do the research and fact check in real time so we don't go into an alternate reality. And so that's why I think it's incumbent upon uh, people of good conscience, specifically Black people, to tell the truth about what's happening right now and what potentially could happen. And I think that's how we um, go into that next um, arena where, just like our ancestors, whether that's Frederick Douglass or Ida B. Wells or W.E.B. Du Bois, who were truth tellers in that time, made sure that we understood what our people had been through and what we will have to continue to persevere and hand to the next generation. And that's why I think it's incumbent upon us to continue on these platforms to give honest, forward looking perspective on where we are, where we're going, and how we get there.
Yeah, and even looking back 50 years from now, I mean, as a lawyer, you know who you studied, right? It's the people
Absolutely.
who look like you, who paved the way and made impact in communities, your community specifically. It's the same with us, from Thurgood Marshall to Bayard Rustin to Tom Burrell. I think we've got to go back and look at how these folks not only existed during their time, but made sure that they won and they won the narrative. And while it may not have overwhelmingly been 10, 20, 30 of them, they did enough to where they were able to supplant their legacy in this generation. And that's another piece of what we need to talk about is how do we ensure that our legacies are supplanted in this generation, how ensuring that our voices are heard in this generation. And so I think these things are extremely important. As you and I were talking about with the data, a lot of folks don't realize like the media, communications, public relations space is not a space overwhelmingly where Black people are. I think it's less than 8% of us in the public sector. Less than 1% of us actually own our own PR firms. And I know those numbers are very similar to Black attorneys. And so while being in a place like Atlanta and seeing it everywhere, it doesn't hold true across the United States of America. And so we've got to find a way to continue to build on these things and ensuring that we're raising up that generation that's not so far down the road, but some of those young kids that are right behind us looking up to us, those 21, 22, 23-year olds, and pointing them in the right direction, because we got to ensure that we're building this thing out and building it out in a way, again, that it lasts through the generations. And I think that what they did during the civil rights movement was so effective because they were able to not only get these laws changed, right? But they held the narrative long enough to where they got into seats of power and they could do something with it. And I think that's something else that we got to really hold on to and look at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what people need to understand is that we are on a continuum of justice. I think Dr. King put it so eloquently. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Well, actually, we have to bend it toward justice. And so when I look at, like you said, in the PR space, 5 to 7%. When you look in the legal space, you look in a legal arena, 5% of America's lawyers are African American. 5%. 3% are Black men, and 2% are Black women. That's 5%. And we, for some reason, are now having this national conversation that there's no need for DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion is a bad thing. I like the way you always put it, that DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, is an illusion because we never achieved it. And so
Facts.
being in from the 70s, one generation into the civil rights movement, we were the ones that benefited from the civil rights movement. We're the ones that benefited from affirmative action. To see them now try to roll it back, and to now see Harvard admissions are now gone down, Black attorney admissions at Harvard have gone down, and see Asian admissions in Harvard have gone down, and to see that national conversation shift when you haven't achieved the diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, for African American lawyers in 2024 to be 5%, when we are not 5% of the population, is appalling. But to then have in this large scale, media narrative, comms narrative, that we've achieved because we had an African American president, or we've achieved because we had an African American vice president. That wasn't achievement. That was the beginning of achievement. That was beginning of diversity. And so I think it's time for professionals like myself, professionals like you, to call it out, to speak it out. Because again, I don't think Thurgood Marshall or Charles Hamilton Houston or Johnny Cochran wanted to be the only ones. Fred Gray, Constance Baker Motley, so many of these legends in African American jurisprudence, some of the ones that I've grown up with, Donald Lee Hollowell and so many others, Fred Gray, didn't want to be the only ones. Wanted to create a legion of African American lawyers who could help lift the African American community and lift other communities, because we all know when the African American boat rises, all ships rise. And so I think as we transition into 2025 into this new world of MAGA, we remind them that America will not be great until everyone in America is great. And that means diversity. And so I think that we have to speak truth to power. And if it means we have to do it on our own platforms, we have to make sure that our kids and our grandchildren understand that at no point, at any point, since we've been in this country, before we got to this country, did we ever lay down? Did we ever quit? Did we ever not be the ones pushing? I think it's incumbent upon that in this generation. So, when I read Eye on the Prize and I realize what happened on Edmonds Pettus Bridge, or I realize what happened, in Greensboro, the Greensboro sit-in movement, or all the other things that happened, we need to be honest in the truth telling of the Black Lives Matter era. So that means the truth telling about what happened in Brunswick, truth telling about what happened in Louisville, truth telling about what happened in Minnesota, truth telling about what happened in Atlanta, and truth telling that this movement is not over. It's as strong as it's ever been. And I think that's incumbent because of the communications and the platforms and the strategies that the activists and the professionals and all of the blue collar individuals and everybody that turned out for the vote are continuing to push that forward. And we have to use these platforms to get that message out.
And G, I want to let's just think about this for a second, right? Just for a second. The fact that in every major industry, we could go from being 1% of that workforce to just 5%. And oh my goodness, the world is coming down. The world is, come on, y'all. And this is, again, to your point, this is why we got to keep telling these stories. Because when I sit back and, even when I was at my former church and I would listen to these guys, man, I look at you, Dontaye, and I see Vincent and I see all these other guys, and y'all are doing well. Y'all worked hard. You pulled yourselves up by your bootstraps. And it's like, huh? I'm one of maybe 2 or 3 folks in these very white spaces. And we made it? No, we didn't make it. We didn't make it. We're far. The money doesn't go through our community, which is why 60-70% of our community is still in poverty, under poverty. I don't even want to talk about what under poverty looks like. But when we have a candidate that's talking about folks just being able to buy a ham sandwich, it resonates because it's hard out here. But again, that's why it's so important for us to be telling these stories and telling them in context. And we got a lot of people that are in these rooms and they're not having these real conversations. They're just not. And we got to hold our leaders accountable, because they owe as much to how our stories are told as we do. And I think that's why I was a little bothered by the six triple eight, because it on the surface it was an excellent movie, but why do we have to add certain components in to make certain people feel good? Were there good white people? Yes, there have been good white people. There have always been some good white people, but there have always been a lot of bad ones as well. And we just got to be honest about this conversation and stop worried about who's getting offended and who's not, and just tell the truth.
Yeah.
That's what this whole thing is about, is the truth.
Yeah. And I think the main thing that people need to understand is that in the telling of the true narrative of America, it's a very difficult story. It's a very complex story. It's a very layered story. And we need to stop trying to romanticize it and tell the truth so that we can get to the point where everyone can say, yes, we are all great. But right now, especially in this political environment, let's just call it what it is. We keep talking about this the most divided America's ever been. This is not the most divided America's ever been. It's not. It's not. We literally fought a civil war. Literally. That was the most divided. When people were trying to own other people, that was the most divided. This right now is a production. And here's the thing that I think a lot of people are not having this conversation about. There were a lot of promises made by a lot of politicians on both sides of the aisle that have never been lived up to. So if we really want to unify this country, let's start living up to everybody's community prospering. There's enough of the pie for the diverse communities to prosper as well as the majority community. Nobody's coming over here trying to steal anybody else's stuff. We're trying to move our country forward by lifting everybody up. And let's be clear, it's always been this division, between the haves and the have-nots. And in order to dissuade people from having that conversation, we want to point at the others and say the others are the ones that are taking our jobs. Remember we had that conversation about black jobs. Remember that? Okay. It's not a lot of our Latino brothers and sisters coming over to take the black jobs. What's happening is automation is taking jobs. What's happening is that because of the cost of living, people are not able to achieve the way they want to. But that's on both sides of the aisle. So as we move into this different political arena, let's remember that folks said, and I'm going to hold them accountable, like I hold Democrats accountable, I hold Republicans accountable. Remember, no tax on tips. I want y'all to write that down. No taxes on tips. Let's make sure that happens, okay? Let's make sure that there's actual immigration reform. They almost had immigration reform in this Congress. So let's actually accomplish that. Let's actually accomplish making sure American jobs stay in America. And there's one other thing we need to accomplish. I think this is a big campaign promise. I remember him saying this specifically. He said he was going to make housing affordable again. Let's make sure we make housing affordable again. These are universal kitchen table issues: jobs, healthcare, housing, immigration reform. We can do all of those things and not take civil rights away from folks. We can literally do that. Let's focus on that. And let's also focus on elected officials being beholden to the people and not billionaires.
That part.
I know we're on a billionaires platform, but that specific billionaire said they want free speech. So I'm freely saying this. Billionaires should not have more rights than everybody else.
And we just gotta, again, it comes back to this truth and honesty, right? We sit over here and we listen to these folks bring up immigration, bring up race, bring up class, bring up all these things. When last time I checked, we all came from two common ancestors. Two. And not only that, right? What this man that gave us this book, right? For those that want to believe in religion, those that don't, at the end of the day, That man said what? Take care of the fatherless, take care of the widows, take care of the poor, the hungry. He was talking about in our own community, right?
Mhm.
And so for us to say we a Christian nation and we ain't carrying out Christian principles is kind of ironic in and of itself. And I think that we just got to have a real conversation because here's the thing, and G, you know this better than 99.9% of Americans. Crime isn't something people just get out and do for fun.
No,
They get out and do for because of desperation.
there
What
are root
situations are making them desperate?
yeah, there are root causes to crime. And I think if we're not addressing the root causes, we're going to continue to throw good money after bad money in incarcerating individuals and not rehabilitating them. And so I know somebody in my comments is probably going to say, oh, he's talking about crime. Why don't they do something about the crime? They do it every day. We'll be doing it tomorrow. It'll be in a courtroom. And we'll determine who actually committed the crime. Because I got a real issue with this, and I'm gonna say something about what's going on in New York. Yes, we spent about a week searching for the alleged killer in the United Healthcare shooting. Let's be clear: someone is innocent until proven guilty. That is the fundamental belief in our criminal justice system. I'm tired of politicians, namely the mayor of New York, perp walking individuals who are innocent. Let the criminal justice system play itself out. But back to my point, as far as the criminal justice system and what's happening in courtrooms around this country, we need to make sure we bring back the fundamentals of innocent until proven guilty and jury trials, because I'm tired of watching on the news this narrative that crime is out of control when we all know the stats show that crime is down, violent crime is down. I tell you what's not up: trials. Trials are not up, but mass incarceration is. And so, why don't we have that conversation about how we can rehabilitate individuals and how returning citizens don't get to, change their course by job training and making sure that they can expunge, those nonviolent offenses, and they can, reintegrate into our community. I was watching this it was a lovely Instagram post. It's called, I think it's called Jesus in Jail or something like that. And they were showing inmates having Christmas with their children. And the first thought that came to my mind is, if we really are about to celebrate this season of Christ, but we still have folks in prison who are not actually receiving the same type of love and affection that we so lavish on him in a manger, when he's a grown man who told you to love your brother as yourself and love God with all your heart. We're not doing those things. So that goes back to what you just said. If we truly are a Christian nation, we're about, you know, giving to the fatherless and taking care of the homeless. Aren't we supposed to visit the prisoners? Aren't we supposed to make sure that they're taken care of? I do this
That
every
part.
single day. And so I'm looking at the system and I'm wondering, what are we doing? Why are we spending more money incarcerating people instead of educating people? Why are we spending more money on locking folks up instead of taking care of their health care? It's easier to build strong children than to incarcerate adults. I literally just left a jail an hour ago. And I'm sitting here watching people on the visitation portal talking to their loved ones. I saw a man mentoring and ministering to a gentleman behind bars. And I'm wondering, as I pass by the lights and the mangers and all the wise men, I'm wondering to myself, are we really doing the work necessary to build a better future? Or are we just following the media narrative of crime, 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 scare, 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 and not fixing the underlying problems that cause the crime, instead of focus on the scare. Because I'll be clear to you. Clear. Listen, y'all. When 90% of these cases actually go to trial, actually
Yep.
you put the evidence up, the
Mm-hmm.
people are not guilty of what they've been charged with. We literally saw it in the YSL trial. We literally continue to see it in these big cases that actually go to trial. You start looking at the evidence and you're like, it wasn't as bad as the state let on. They
Yep.
didn't have as much evidence as they were saying. This person is actually innocent. But because we like, horror stories, we like true crime narratives, like the John Benet Ramsey case. I've been watching that on Netflix. That's a perfect example of, if you don't have money, they can weaponize the system against you and make it appear that you are the criminal, when the criminal actually, if you go through the forensics, if you go through actual investigative work, you will see that these potential crimes are solvable, but we want a quick ending to a story and we skip steps.
Man, we got work to do. We got
Yeah.
work. We got a ton of work to do.
Yeah.
And
And
I'm
so I
glad
mean
we
that's why we're gonna do these platforms more often. I know people talk to Dontaye, they talk to me, and they're like, why don't you talk about this more? And my thing is, most of the time, y'all, honestly, I'm so focused on trying to fix the problem, I don't get on here and talk and educate and let y'all know what the truth is behind a lot of this. And the truth is this: there is more that we have in common than what separates us. If we would focus on what brings us together instead of focusing on what separates us. Many times folk are always saying, oh, you a part of this or you a part of that. You anti this, I'm not anti anything. I'm pro truth and I'm pro justice, which means sometimes I have to call things out and it's uncomfortable. I will call out any politician. I don't care if you got a D or an R. If you're not doing right, I'm gonna call you out. But
yeah.
also, what we have to understand is it's incumbent upon our generation to be honest, to be truthful about where we are in this moment. We are in one of the most consequential periods in history, and folks are acting like this stuff is normal. It's not normal. And so we must call out the lack of normality, and that's why we're relaunching these platforms.
And we just got to keep getting loud. We just got to keep getting loud because what we're seeing is we're in a world right now that's void of truth, that's void of justice, and we got to bring it back into the space. We have to center it back into these spaces, and I hope that our folks, our influencers, our people out here who are passionate about justice, who are passionate about people, who are passionate about love and action, who are passionate about all these things, really take time to just not chase the clout of what's going on the internet and chase the clout of what's going on in the community. Because, and I say what's going on in the community because these things have not changed. They haven't changed. They haven't. It's they get recycled every generation. And if we're not going to be the ones that say, you know what, we're going to change some things in this generation, what are we doing for these kids? What are we doing for the grandchildren that are coming behind them? And that's why folks get so frustrated because they know that we know. You know what I'm saying? It's not like it's a secret that the black community is full of poverty. It's not a secret that our community is desperate. It's not a secret that a large majority of America is hurting right now. It ain't a secret. We all see it. But because nobody's talking about it is why 70% of the folks don't vote, or why 70% of these folks are disengaged. Like they're literally spending billions of dollars on the 15% who are invested in the system because they actually benefit from the system instead of actually saying, you know what, let's go talk to this other 70% and see if we can engage them in a process. They do realize what happened in the civil rights movement was so powerful is because they injected a new group into the voting pool, into the voting block. That's what was. It wasn't like they just got the right to vote and didn't show up. No, they actually brought a strong block. But the only way you keep that block together is by what? Making sure that they're also receiving some of these benefits.
Yeah.
And we're not doing that.
Yeah, I think people need to understand that voting is transactional. It's a transactional activity.
Yep.
And, many people have not received good on that transaction. You can't just tell people to vote every 2 or 4 years and then not talk to them anymore.
Yep.
And I think that's what a lot of our politicians fail to realize. What you do to win votes continues after the election. I mean, the election is the beginning, and that's why it's important. Next month they'll be in session at the Gold Dome. We'll be down there, hold them accountable to every single campaign promise they made, and we'll be bringing more and more of Georgia to the Gold Dome. That's why Georgia's engaged like most of the other states aren't. It's because they have understood over the last 8 years we've been in election season for the entire time. And so, we do get election fatigue, but we don't, get fatigue long because we all know that we got to hold these folks accountable. Another reason why we're going back down to Brunswick, January the 21st, we'll be down in Brunswick, Georgia to continue to run with Ahmaud Arbery and his family for justice. The trial of Jackie Johnson will be happening then. So, please continue to lift that family up in your prayers and make sure you are present at the courthouse to make sure that justice happens. Because again, in Georgia, we know we have to be present. We have to make sure that the system works the way it's supposed to work for justice. And so we have to make sure we're there for that. But the most important thing that we have to do, y'all, we have to love on one another. We have to love on one another in truth. We have to love on one another and make sure that our brothers and sisters are taken care of. And we have to make sure, y'all can hear my son in the back. He's doing what he does. But we have to make sure that that next generation understands that we are not going to allow courage to skip this generation. Listen, I loved what Dr. King did. I love what Muhammad Ali did. I got a chance to meet his second wife. And that's a whole nother story. I'll tell y'all that. Make sure you get her book, Undefeated. Tells a lot of the story of Muhammad Ali from the side. We haven't seen it before. But what we have to understand is courage will not skip this generation. So we can talk about what they did all day long. What are you doing? What are you doing to make sure when your grandchildren tell your story, it's granddad and grandma stood up, they fought, they, transferred the rights that their grandparents had fought hard for, many died for, bled for, to pass it to the next generation so they had it and they enhanced it. Y'all, we're not trying to go backwards, and we're not going backwards. And so that's why it's important that you lift up these platforms. I see a lot of trash on these platforms, but y'all have
A
to
lot.
understand. Y'all have to understand. This the new TV. So if you wouldn't do whatever you're doing on CNN, on MSNBC, on Fox, ABC, CBS, all those, don't do it on here. Listen, because again, this right here will be on these platforms forever. And so when your grandkids are scrolling through the platforms, because that's what they do, y'all seen it. You've seen your granddaughter, your grandson, your son, your daughter, your niece, your nephew. This is their television. This right here, this is the television. This television, not the big screen that's out in the living room, but this is their television. And so they are consuming it, and they are watching it, and they are taking it all in, and they're wondering to themselves, what are my parents doing to make sure my life's better? You know, we hear, I mean, next month we're gonna be talking about him for about a week. We're gonna talk about Dr. King. It's gonna be Dr. King week. And then we're gonna transition from Dr. King week into Black History Month. So the first part of the first part of the year is gonna be super black. It's gonna be real black. But my question is, what are we doing to continue the story of America as America continues to become diverse? Because America is going to become diverse. That's just clear. I reposted the whole comment with Richard Spencer from a few years ago, just to send a point. One, this is the overall thought process of certain people in this country. I was right. And then here's how it's going to actually end. Brown. But what we have to understand is that in that transition period, how do we make sure that diversity is a strength? How do we make sure that, yes, we calm the concerns of a certain group of people in this country? I believe 50% of them can be calmed a little bit. but we also focus on moving forward for the rest of the country that wants to leave 1950 in 1950 and wants to actually get to 2050. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to be what our ancestors foresaw, and that is a generation of achievers that leads us into this. We're in a new millennium, y'all, in the new millennium, and not repeat the mistakes of the previous millennium.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that because I mean, listen, we already know it. That 50% you were talking about won't, right?
Yeah,
They want the Leave It to Beaver, the I Love Lucy lifestyle, right? The
yeah,
working one job, wife being able to stay home. Listen, y'all can have whatever you want from 50, 60 years ago, except the racism.
yeah,
You can have all that stuff. We can get back to that. We can start organizing, mobilizing. We can do all that stuff. You just got to leave the racism and the misogyny behind. Leave that stuff behind, and we'll step into the 22nd century with y'all, and we'll kumbaya. We'll hold hands. We'll do all that stuff. I'm about that life. But the reality is we can't have any more Ahmaud Arbery's, and that's the reality.
no,
And that's why Georgia, to your point, G, has been so engaged because not only did we march and protest and shout, we got what?
new
Legislation
legislation.
and
We sent some
convictions.
folks to prison,
Hmm.
and we made sure a message was sent to the rest of the country. Because again, and like you just said, we're not doing this anymore.
Yeah.
I listen, like you said, man, and I'm all for that. If y'all screen grab this, I would love to stop marching and protesting and move into that new area of life where
Mm.
everybody achieve. Yeah, I mean, listen, I would love to have one job, my wife not work, a white picket fence, a Chevrolet, and two dogs and two children. I already got the two children. I have a dog and
I
live
got
that
four. You
life.
want to?
That was the 1950s. But it needs to be the 1950s lifestyle for everybody. Because again, y'all ever wonder in the 50s, where were the black people? Like, where were the black people in all these shows?
On the
Like,
other
there were
side
no
of
black
town.
people in the 50s.
Man, I mean, Friends. They had like there was no black folks in the
No black people in
90s.
the 90s. Where are the black people? Listen, black people exist. We have always existed. We have always been some of the best citizens of this country. We're just asking for this country to act like it's diverse. You know, we have Asian brothers and sisters. We have Hispanic brothers and sisters. We have black brothers and sisters. We have LGBTQIA brothers and sisters. We got folks that don't identify with anything, and I don't have a problem with that. You know why I don't have a problem with that? Because I can't put my values on anybody else. So why? That's the most American of beliefs. Everybody has a right to believe whatever they want. That's the First Amendment. Again, it comes back to being the lawyer in me. That's the First Amendment. The first. How are we still running around here talking about the Second Amendment is more important than the first?
That
We
part.
have folks in this country that want to take away the 19th Amendment. Wait a minute now. Why are we trying to take away women's right to vote? I mean, shouldn't they have a voice? Why we have people, and I posted about this, who want to take away the 14th Amendment, saying that what did they say? Birthright citizenship should be abolished. You do know that that particular amendment was for the black people. The black people had to fight hard for the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. We actually talking about taking away the 14th Amendment. Again, y'all, this is not American. This is not American thought process. America is supposed to be moving towards more rights, not taking rights away. I
Call
remember
it
in law
out.
school. There were certain classes. It was black letter law. It was just this is how it is. You know, guess what case was founded on the 14th Amendment? Brown versus
Brown
the Board
versus
of
Board of
Education.
Education. Yep.
Hmm. I wonder why folks are trying to attack the 14th Amendment. There's some other substantive due process cases that we will save for another time that were founded on the 14th Amendment. And so I don't understand this, except for the last time they tried to attack the 14th Amendment, legions of lawyers stood up. And if you attack the 14th Amendment or any of the other civil rights amendment, legions of lawyers will stand up. And my hope is that lawyers of good conscience will focus on one of the greatest quotes in jurisprudence. There was a great lawyer from Harvard University. He was a Harvard University lawyer, one of the first. His name was Charles Hamilton Houston. And Charles Hamilton Houston said a lawyer is either one of two things. He's either a social engineer or a parasite. Social engineer, parasite. I and many of the lawyers like me have spent their entire career trying to not be a parasite. Social engineer. And I think that's what's important. And if he was saying that in the 20s, the 1920s, we need to say that in the 2020s, because it's incumbent upon lawyers of good conscience to, one, stand up for the rule of law. The Constitution applies to everybody, regardless of their status. I'm going to be clear on one last thing, and I'm going to turn it over to Dontaye for the last word, and then we're going to shut this live down. But I'm going to leave y'all with this one right here. Nowhere in the Constitution of the United States of America does it say anybody is above the law. That's in the Constitution. I understand certain courts may be interpreting things differently, but I also know that history views the court in different light depending on the doctrines that are being handed down. If the court doesn't get on the right side of history, the court will end up similar to courts that said separate but equal, courts that said African Americans were three-fifths of a person, courts that said black folks didn't have any rights to sue anybody. But I also know this. Legions of lawyers decided to follow what Charles Hamilton Houston said. One of those is the greatest Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. His name was Thurgood. I think there should be more lawyers like Thurgood. I think that there should be more lawyers like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I think that there should be more civil rights lawyers, because at the end of the day, it's going to take a whole lot of marching, a whole lot of protesting, but a whole lot of suing, and a whole lot of holding folks accountable to what the law actually says. Because just Friday, I was in a courtroom in DeKalb County with a whole lot of allegations, and I know the law said my client walked out of there, and he walked out of there. And so I just hope that people understand the moment in history that we are in, what it's going to take to make sure that moment of history is just a speed bump to the change that needs to come. And again, I hope for America's sake that the president-elect starts to read the Constitution and understand that he has certain powers and he has certain other powers, but he can only do certain things. Because the 10th Amendment says this, and I've been teaching Dontaye this, I'm going to teach y'all this. All power not expressly given to the federal government is reserved for the states. So as for Georgia, we're going to follow the Constitution, both the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of Georgia, because there are certain people that are sworn to protect those constitutions. And I hope my brothers and sisters in the bar catch where I'm going with this. You know, we're not supposed to just be sitting back, allowing this stuff to happen. Just, oh, we don't know what's going on. It seems right. So we just go, no, that's not. We are the third co-equal branch, and we need to act like it. So, Dontaye, I know we've been on here a little longer than I thought we were going to go. This is supposed to be a test. But this is the flavor you're going to get as we continue to move forward. We have at least 4 years of this, if not longer. We've been doing this longer than 4 years. So, this is just going to continue to be what we do. But
Yeah.
what's your last thoughts to the people?
My last thoughts is this, y'all. We had about 231 of y'all that tapped in. That's what I was when I was looking down. I was looking at Twitter. So we appreciate y'all chiming in. As Attorney Griggs just said, this is gonna be the flavor of what you're gonna get, and we're gonna bring it real. We're gonna bring it raw. It's gonna be uncut. Attorney Griggs might be he might be a little more polite with with how he says his, but we gonna get it out, and we're gonna have some real conversations because we got to talk about healthcare. I'm not just talking about abortion rights. I'm talking about healthcare, how it impacts Black women, and how it impacts the legacies, right, of the men who want to bring children into this world. We got to have a full conversation about that, y'all. So that's gonna be it. We're gonna talk about economics, and we're gonna get real about what the problems are. So y'all keep tuning in. We're gonna have this conversation. Thank y'all for tuning in, and we'll see y'all next week, G?
Probably next week. And y'all in the comments, please tell us what other topics you want us to hit, because this is going to be an interactive conversation. I love these new platforms, because one, we get to engage with you, but two, you get a better understanding of who we are, how multifaceted we are, and how we truly love our community, all of our community. And we are trying to move this country forward, trying to move the state forward, and we're trying to move forward in unison. So if you haven't already, like, comment, and subscribe. Make sure that you tell a friend to tell a friend that we're going to have real conversation about politics, about justice, about messaging, but more importantly, about community building, because that's what an organizer really is. It's a community builder. It's somebody that lifts everybody up, brings us together, speaks truth to power, whether that's comfortable or uncomfortable. And then we try to make the world a better place than the one we found. And we're going to do that regardless of who the president of the United States is, or the governor, or the mayor, or whoever. We're going to do that. We're going to bring it live and uncut, the way that the people that trained us made sure we did it. So in the spirit of Vincent Ford, we going to speak truth to power. We going to call some folks out. We going to also call some folks in. But I love y'all. I'm the justice fighter, Attorney Gerald Griggs. Dontaye Carter, Fight Harder with Carter. Follow us on all social media platforms. Follow the Justice Fighter podcast that we are relaunching. Dontaye, tell them how they can follow your podcast.
We on there, Beyond the Brand, all on platforms. So, Spotify everywhere. So Beyond the Brand, y'all. We're gonna be talking a little bit more about these, but from the point of view of owning the narratives. We've had a lot of great folks in, from civil rights activists, small business owners. Again, across the board, it's about owning the narratives. But gee, we got 92 people on here right now. 92. So I've seen it fluctuate between 88 and 92. And I say, man, we did that today for a
Yeah,
nice little test run.
I thought it was just going to be a test stream, but clearly you guys want to hear more. So we're going to do this every week. Like I said, drop in the comments whatever topics you want us to cover, and we're going to bring it raw and unfiltered. You're going to get us to see a side of us that you haven't seen before. And hopefully you understand that we are in this together, and we're not going to take one step back. So love y'all. We'll see y'all on the next stream.